uphina kuphi emakhaya emadolobheni nasenkomplasta khona lapho ubukela khona SABC 1 sabungele komhlelo kembukele kulungelo lakho it's your right lo hlelo kulunethela ke konke lokuthinta wena njengemthengi mina ke ngisimpiwe ngcongwane bekunene simo sendlala noma ke kuswela kudla kwemindeni leminingi sekumthwalo lomadima lapha ke eNingizimu Afrika ingabe lokho kubangelwa yini but while so many people go without food on a daily basis South Africa produces millions of tons per annum asisingene endzabeni yethu kuva ukuthi ke kubangelwa yini ukuthi abantu balambe kangaka kube khona kudla lokuningi lapha eNingizimu Afrika Hunger is an everyday reality in the lives of so many South Africans. At least 10 million go to bed in an empty stomach, yet tons of food goes to waste every single year. How can we ensure that the food we produce goes to every stomach instead of the dumps? Manje khuluma kabanti ke ngesimo sendlala nekuswela ke kudla ke eNingizimu Afrika asimukele ivakathe namhla we welcome via Skype Matlou Setati from the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa and from the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research Council we welcome Professor Suzan Oelofse. Ladies, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Oelofse, I'm going to start with you. We see that South Africa, doesn't have a food shortage, but there is an increasing, level of food wastage. Why is this the case, though? Why are we seeing food wastage every single year?
Okay, let me start by explaining why our current estimates are higher than the previous. I think that will put things in perspective. In around 2013, we did the first estimate of food wastage in South Africa, and at that point in time, we used the assumptions that were made for the global assessment of food waste for sub-Saharan Africa as assumptions for South Africa, because we didn't have local South African data. Since that study was published, we also saw a report that came out by the original authors of the global report quantifying how they got to the estimates. And then we realized that the assumptions that were used for sub-Saharan Africa is not necessarily 100% applicable to the South African situation. And therefore, we customized our assumptions based on local South African research, both that was published previously as well as new primary data that we collected as part of this project. And then we redid the calculation. And this new latest updated calculation is that we waste 10.3 million tons of food per year versus the 10.2 million tons that we saw in the that we estimated previously. Now that in itself is not a big difference, but what we did see is that there is a shift in the wastage occurring across the different stages of the supply chain. For instance, in the previous study, it was estimated that the majority of the losses occur on farm and in the pre-consumer stages of the supply chain, whereas this study now clearly indicated that the majority of the wastage happens at processing and packaging. And also at consumer level, we saw now an estimated 18% of the waste being generated versus our previous estimate that it was only 5% at consumption level. So that in itself is quite concerning. And the reason for the wastage along the supply chain is actually an indication of inefficiencies in the entire supply chain. We can do a lot to prevent food wastage, and that is also why the United Nations set a target for reducing food waste by 50% by 2030 because of the opportunities to reduce food wastage along the supply chain.
But Professor, do we know who the culprits are of food wastage? And is there even legislation perhaps that is put in place to sort of regulate food wastage?
There are not specific legislation regulating food wastage other than the normal waste legislation. But who the culprits are, it is just about everybody along the food supply chain that are contributing to the food waste. It's difficult to point a finger and say it's one specific organization or person, because it all depends on the efficiencies in the specific stage of the supply chain, what we see there. But as I said, a lot of the wastage is happening at the processing and packaging stage, and that points a finger towards the consumer, because it is what the consumer buys that will determine what gets processed into which types of products, and also which of the food will make it into the packaging that will in the end up on the shelves for the consumers to buy. So at this stage of the supply chain, all the produce that is not perfect or that have blemishes on or are bruised will already be taken out, and that is what is contributing then a lot of the wastage. And then at household level, obviously, a lot of what gets wasted there is as a result of poor planning on the side of consumers, both in terms of how we manage the food in our households, but also how we prepare food and how we deal with food in general.
Now, Matlou, let me also bring you into this conversation. Now, we've seen some of these big retail and supermarket chains dumping food that is well edible instead of donating it to certain organizations. Why do we see that? Why is this the case when so many millions of people go to bed hungry?
Umbuzo wakho ucacile Simphiwe, and angisho ngithi lento lesidibane nayo, it is not only for South Africa, it is a global challenge. And for the retailers, let me speak for the CGCSA member base that I know we work closely with, and we have seen this come into play during the civil unrest that came to be recently in the few weeks that passed, where we saw a manufacturer, for example, that could not sell the products because the stock was dedicated for KZN, or there was surplus food that was supposed to go all over the country. So with that unrest, they made sure that the food is rechanneled to the NGOs. And we are comfortable in that retailers locally are doing so much. And I understand where you're coming from in terms of you could have seen it elsewhere, but there is a lot that is happening in terms of retailers channeling food to the NGOs. And the NGOs are doing a brilliant job in redistributing the food. And I must say, with all the education that Prof has already shared, there's still a lot to learn in the full value chain in terms of how do people prevent from the onset, because the first thing that we need to do is to prevent. And in most cases, when I present cases, as umtengi in your household, if you do not measure the waste that you produce, you will end up with a problem because you do not know what you are wasting. So how are you going to deal with the problem? So in most cases, we emphasize and we motivate whoever that we work with in the field, either being the manufacturers or the retailers, to say, measure what you produce. And if you see that you're producing something that is surplus and is still edible, channel it to the NGOs that will further redistribute it to the people that need it. So we are calling on...
I guess that is my question, Matlou. These big supermarket chains and food retailers, abakwendi lokho?
Ake ngithi ngizokhuluma uma ngabe kunalo akubonayo lokho, contacte CGCSA, because angifuni ukubiza amagama wema retailers last dealer nawo la ba sign up to the voluntary agreement that we put together with them, that there shall be no food that goes to the dump site. Every food that is edible needs to go to the NGOs. Ake ngithi ngibize wonke umphakathi uma nibona i-retailer ithatha ukudla ikwisa ku-landfill, ake niscontacte nisitsheleni ukuthi ikuphi, siyenze ukuthi sidibane nabo, sibafundise ukuthi benze kanjani, because sometimes it might not be the people that work with the CGCSA, but we have opened it up to everyone to come to the party and work on this challenge.
Ingabe akhona nema prevention and waste management solutions lakhona ke in place, especially by Consumer Goods Council of South Africa?
So into esiyenzile njengoba uProf sekashilo, sifollowa imithetho ebekwe United Nations under the Sustainable Development Goals 12.3 le ithi asenzeni i-prevention kokucala. Ilento lesikhomithe ukuthi soyenza, masebenzeni si-prevent ukuthi kungabi ne-waste in our facilities, in our households, at a manufacturer level, at a retailer level. And after that, if there is no way that we can prevent the waste, let's redistribute it to the people. If we fail, there's a hierarchy that we follow. If we fail to redistribute it to the people, the food gets off, let's compost the food. And this happens also in our households. If you cannot redistribute, share with your neighbor, share with the NGOs close to you, make compost, feed the animals so that we don't get any food going to landfill. And that is the process that we follow in terms of preventing and reducing food loss and waste.
All right, Matlou, thank you so much for raising that point with us. Please stay on the line. Now, Professor, why is there seemingly a disconnect between where the food is and where it needs to be?
I think the main reason for that is that because we are an urbanized society, people have become divorced from where the food comes from.
Yes.
People don't realize that a tomato grows on a plant. It doesn't come out of a factory, and therefore not all tomatoes are perfectly round. And depending on the local conditions, the sun may be harsh on the one side, and therefore the tomato is not equally the same color throughout. And I think that is where part of the disconnect comes from. People expect of the food that they buy in the shops to be perfect, like as if they come out of a factory, whereas it comes from the farm. And then also, because consumers are quite picky in what they want to buy and what it must look like, this is then the standards that get set by the retailers, and this is what the farmers then have to comply with. So therefore, the farmer will not even package some of the food that they produce. If it's too big, if it's not the correct size, if it's crooked, then it won't even make it into the packet. So I think that is also where awareness is necessary. And I think if we can get people to start growing a bit more of their own food, they will also realize that it's not that easy to only grow straight carrots or straight cucumbers and round tomatoes. So I think that is where the disconnect actually sits. And then what we also found in our research is a lot of the food that is wasted currently is as a result of surplus production. And this is because a farmer cannot predict 100% how much of what he plant will grow and what the crop size would be. But then you also get now, there's quite a number of small-scale farmers entering the market, and they look at what other people buy and what is the majority of the vegetables and fruits that are available in the market, and they will plant exactly those. And that will then also contribute to surplus, which in the end is negative to them, because if there's surplus, then the price drops. So I think if we can, in a way, just plan better what we plant, when we plant, to feed what is the demand by the consumers, that will already help a lot. But then we've also learned in our research that because we have such a retail-driven society, retailers tend to sometimes over-order to make up for under-delivery, and that also contributes then to overproduction. Because we as consumers want to walk into the shop, the shelves must be full, we want to buy what we need at the shop at the time, and if it's not available there, then we badmouth the retailer, which is not necessarily their fault. And in that process, we also drive food wastage.
Okay, Professor, please stay on the line. We'll certainly continue with this conversation after the break. Please do join us after this break. Yilungelo lakho ke bekunene sanimukela futhi tincingo ntefa sedivuriwe ukuthi ke nawe ngaba ingcenye lenkulumo yethu namhla ungasishaya licingo ku-011 7146918 noma ke 011 7146919. You can also email your thoughts to consumer@sabc.co.za or rather interact with us on our Facebook page. Namhla ke sikhuluma ke nge-food wastage. Siyathi ke ukuthi ke lapha eNingizimu Afrika sikhicita ke millions and millions of tons of food. Kepha ke banenge bantu labaya embhedzeni noma ke balale bangakadli ngendzaba ye-food wastage. Sibonile ke supermarket supermarket lamaningi alahla kudla acitha kudla lo kudla ke lokusaphila kanye nathi ke ama-consumer nathi ke emakhaya sinawo lo mkhutshana loyo kulahla kudla kusaphila babe bantu balamba lengaphandle labanye ke bangakhoni ukuthola kudla namhla ke sina Matlou Setati ubuya ke e-Consumer Goods Council of South Africa kanye ke na Professor Suzan Oelofse from the CSIR. Now Matlou, before we enter the ad break simvile ke Professor uthi ke lomunye ke umkhutshana uma supermarkets they tend to over order the food or the food products to cover up for the under delivery of food or food products and hence leading to overproduction. Whose fault is it then? Hi Matlou, ubuyile nathi mama.
Oh, apologies, I was muted.
Okay.
Ake ngithi question yakho inkulu. As we normally say that the system is interconnected. Like Prof has said, the consumer demand picks up what the retailer orders and then pokes into what the manufacturer manufactures. So to move all of these things systematically and ensure that everyone remains competitive, the shelves as we know them are perfect and good and filled to capacity, it is a huge task. So this is why we have put in place all of these conversations to say, how do we make it work? To ensure that we don't give pressure to the manufacturers to manufacture more. How do we see each other? If the system does not see each other, we are not going to resolve this. We need to know what is the demand from the consumer. And you can imagine consumer behavior and consumer preferences change. Seasonally, they might look for a particular product. In the other season, they might look for another product. So we have to sit together, put in the technology and say, how does the system see each other and still remain competitive? Because remember, we've got this issue where each and every one needs to find their competitive edge in terms of competing in the South African market as per legislation. So we need to break those walls and ensure that the system sees each other so that we don't end up with an imbalance in the production, in the supply, and also in the consumption. And with that, we will get somewhere. And I think between all the role players, if we can come together, sizoyithola inxazululo on this challenge.
You know, Matlou, siyathi ukuthi from the farmer's perspective, or should I say from the retailer's perspective, kunemehluko between food that is that meets certain standards of the customer and food that is edible generally. Asengibekise ke a farmer grows ama-veg noma ke ama-fruits only for exports. Asasibekise njenge-cucumber. Kuthi ke nangabe i-client overseas in the European markets, in the American markets bafuna i-cucumber leconzile. Naye ke farmer ke seyiletha i-cucumber lengathi igobekile kancane bese ke i-client ithi ke ayisayifuni le cucumber leyo and only to find ukuthi le cucumber leyo ayikaboli iphile nje isesaka. What normally happens? Loko does it give the retailer the right ukuthi ke ikulahle loko kudla loko ngoba il-customer layo alisakufuni?
Aha, into lowishilo iyona the crux of where we find ourselves. The export market gets the A grade, which goes as perfectly as we need it, and it goes and it's shipped, and it makes market and market sense in terms of the person that grows the food must get their money and returns. So in terms of the croquette or what we call ugly fruits and vegetables, what we are motivating to the local suppliers, even though we need not what is the English? Sibayenze bangabi competitive in their marketing of products, because as you said, the export market will get the best, and we expect the local market to get the ones that they can absorb, even though they have committed to sell whatever that they can find in the market. We need to work together and educate the consumer to say, at some point, when you find an imperfect product in the shelf locally, just know that we are capturing all the products that need to be captured in the market so that we don't incur any losses. And another thing that we emphasize, even though in most cases you find that manufacturers or farmers, if something it is not their key thing to do, like someone who's got tomatoes may not be interested in doing tomato sauce. And that is why we're trying to push them to say, have some little of processing so that when you have tomatoes that you cannot sell, you can process them and sell them as a value-added product so that we can work with each other in terms of capturing the food that we might lose. But everyone needs to stay competitive in as much as the market in the EU and export get the best of the fruits. So that is where the system comes in terms of it needs to see each other, it needs to talk to each other.
Now, Professor Oelofse, what are your thoughts on this? Do you want to pick up on what Matlou has just said? Because we've seen so many exporters and retailers and farmers alike exporting only A-grade food or food products to European or, to the international markets and only gives the B-grade foods to the local market. That doesn't sit well with me, and I'm sure it doesn't with you and millions of other South Africans as well.
I agree, it doesn't sit well with the consumers, but I think we must understand that the farmers are business people, and therefore they will sell their produce at the best market that they can for the highest price so that their business makes sense. And if you take into consideration that the food that gets exported must be of such a quality that it can stay in perfect good health for 2 to 3 weeks during export before it reaches the market overseas, then you can understand why the B grade is not packed for the export market. Because by the time it reaches the export market, the A grade may be similar to what we see as a B grade on this side. So I think we must just keep that in mind, that our farmers are business people. They also seek to make the best money that they potentially can while also producing for the South African market. And quite often we also benefit from their exports because they would export produce that is not necessarily common to South Africa, but what is left over after they've exported, they will push into the South African market, then also providing us with a bigger variety of produce that we don't necessarily would otherwise see in South Africa.
How many people could be fed then if we intercepted the food to be wasted at the right stage?
I don't have a specific answer to that one, Matlou. I don't know if you perhaps have an idea.
Matlou, do you want to pick up on that?
That's a difficult one to pick up now. I don't have the numbers, but it's a lot of people. If you can imagine 10 million of food that is wasted, it is a lot of money. It's a lot of money indeed, and food that could be rechanneled to feed people.
Okay, Matlou, please stay on the line, and as well as Professor Suzan Oelofse, please stay on the line. We'll continue this conversation in a moment. Asiphinze ke sijikela ngasetitolo futhi mbukeli sitawubuya khona nyalo. Leli Yilungelo lakho ungasanyakati. It's your right, and a warm welcome back. Our studio lines are now open for you to take part. Ungasishayela licingo ke mbukele ku 0117146918 noma ke 0117146919. Ungasithumela futhi ne-email ku consumer@sabc.co.za or catch us on our social media platforms. Namhla ke sikhuluma ke nge-food wastage noma ke kulahlwa noma ke kumoshwa noma ke ukuchithwa kwekudla kube ke kukhona kudla kanti ke kukhona abantu ke labalala bangakadli ukuthi lo mkhuhlane lo ubangelwa yini. Sithini into ethu namhla sichazile ukuthi ke everybody is a culprit in this particular matter, the retail sector, the farmers and as well as the consumers. Nathi sinawo lo mkhuhlane lo wekuchitha kudla ke kudla kusaphila babe ke bantu balambile. Namhla ke sina Matlou Setati yena ke representer ke the retail sector. She's from the Consumer Good Council of South Africa. Siphinze sibe na Professor Suzan Oelofse yena ke ubuya CSIR. It's a research institute. Now, Professor, is there a relation perhaps between food waste and the rising food prices here in South Africa?
I definitely think so, yes. I think we must keep in consideration that the food wastage also drive prices up of food that's on the shelves, because the retailers and the manufacturers and actually everybody in the supply chain who has waste that needs to be managed will add the cost of managing that waste onto the price when they sell it on to the next stage in the supply chain. And this then result in us paying more for the food that we get at the retail level because of the accumulated prices that's added on top to deal with the food wastage at the end. And this is specifically looking at the cost of end-of-life disposal of food. But I think what is also important to note is that a lot of the food that we currently count as food waste is not necessarily going to end up on landfill, because we added into that calculation the food that is diverted to NPOs for human consumption, as well as the food that goes to other users when it's no longer fit for human consumption. Because we looked at this from a food security perspective, and therefore are concerned about the food that was produced for human consumption, but that does not necessarily make it into the human stomach. And I think it's also important to note that as the retailers are often seen as big wasters, they also are bound by regulations that state that food have to move off their shelves by the sell-by date. And it's not because the food is necessarily bad at that point in time, but it's there to make provision for the fresh produce to again move onto the shelves. So they are just like a station, which have to make provision for the trains leaving so that new ones can come in. And that result then also in consumers sometimes reading the date labels incorrectly, assuming that a sell-by date means that you have to use the goods by that date, whereas it is still perfectly fine for consumption after the sell-by date. Even the best before date that is stamped on produce is not to say that the day after that date it is bad for consumption. There are certain produce that actually is nicer to consume after the best before date, because the best before date is the last date that the producer is actually liable for the quality that they put into the packet. Therefore, they would determine that by a certain date, the tomato will still be the correct color and the correct firmness, whereas the day after the best before date, it may turn redder and sweeter, which may even make it nicer to consume at that point in time. Bananas is an excellent example. They produce more sugars and become sweeter after the best before date. So I think that is just what we need to consider. The only date that is really aimed at the consumer is the expiry date or the use by date. And that is also, again, not directly linked to food safety, but it is linked to protecting the producer of the food and the manufacturer in case somebody falls ill. Then if it's past the expiry date, they cannot be held liable anymore. But that does not mean that the milk after the expiry date is necessarily bad. It's just if you still want to consume it,
these dates are not linked to food safety, but I suppose then it is a very important date for the consumer to note, or whoever is buying that particular product to note. I suppose then, is it the reason why people start throwing away food? Is it the reason why retailers start dumping food? And which date in particular should consumers be more concerned of? Is it the sell-by date? Is it the expiry date, or the best before date, or maybe the use-by date?
Well, as I tried to explain, the expiry date is what is important for the consumer, because if they consume the food after that date and get sick, then they have nobody to blame. If they consume food before that date and they felt sick, then there is somebody to blame. So yes, that is the date that is important for the consumer. The sell-by date is the date that is important for the retailer, because that is the date that they must ensure that it's no longer on their shelves. And this is often then the food that gets donated, the food that is past the sell-by date, but before the best before date or before the expiry date. It's only food that the cold chain is very important, like your frozen meat and fish, that is really concerned about human health when it comes to the dates that is put on the package. And then again, it also, the date itself also is tied to the maintaining of the cold chain up until that date. Because if the cold chain doesn't get maintained right from the start, then long before the expiry date, the food may already be off. So in the end, before a consumer consumes food, irrespective of the date on the package, they must still apply their minds and decide whether or
Professor,
not
you've just
the food
opened our
looks and
eyes
smells.
with regards to the dates that we should focus on. But then the reason I've asked that question previously is because on each and every product, there is either the expiry date or the best before date or the use by date. It doesn't reflect all these dates, only one of each. So which one should we focus on? I mean, if a product has been labeled with an expiry date, or maybe, say for argument's sake, with the use by date, should it also be on the lookout for the expiry date? How do we know when this particular product will be up for expiry?
I know there is currently legislation in South Africa about what date labels must be on the food.
Okay.
I think it is important then to also note that there is a drive internationally to move away from more than one date to only a single date. But as a consumer, you should be aware of the expiry date on food.
Okay, all right. Let's leave it there for now, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. And Matlou Setati, please note that, because we'll definitely touch base with you with regards to the expiry dates on some of the food products. Let's take another commercial break. Hlala nasi ke mbukelo ngasanyakati. Leli ke Yilungelo Lakho. Welcome back. Abantu bagethu nisishayele ku-0117146918 noma ke-0117146919. These are participation lines. Nakuya ke kulapha screening right now. You can also email your thoughts or future topic suggestions to consumer@sabc.co.za. Namhla ke sina Matlou Setati from the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, kanye ke na Professor Suzan Oelofse from the CSIR. Namhla ke sikhuluma ke nge-food wastage, ukuthi ke bantu kubangelwa yini ukuthi bakulahle kudla noma ke bakucithe kube khona labanye ke labalala ke bangakalambi. Lo sikubonile kwendiwa ngama-supermarket lamaningi, kanye ke nathi sina emakhaya, the consumers themselves, sinawo ke lo mkhutshana wekulahla kudla. Now, Matlou, we were touching base with the professor earlier on with regards to the expiry dates and the labeling on the food products. Kuthi ke kubangwa yini lokuthi some of these products kune expiry date, lamanye ke kune best before date, lamanye kune use by date or sell by date. Why kungabi ne date yinye? Why isn't there one date that we should all be focusing on?
I wish there was an easy solution, because our products were to ahlukene. Mastarte example ye fish that is sold fresh. Leyo ufanele uqiniseke ukuthi by a certain date. That is why that product might carry an expiry. Definitely at this point, if you consume this, you might have danger in terms of your health. So umasbega ama products normally, as per legislation, they would carry the production date, that is the date enziwe ngayo. They say I carry the date that will advise you as to the end of life, be it a best before or an expiry date. Manje into le ngifanele ngiyishiye nama consumers ekhaya nayi best before in most cases izoba ama products that are not highly perishable. This can be your dry products and so forth. Lawa product uma uthola kune best before, user your own judgment. Anyone can still sell and can still consume that particular product, because it's not going to affect you in terms of the safety aspects. The chocolate maybe might have some white thing on top because there's some reaction, not that it will affect you. The quality has just gone down. Expiry, that is why in most cases angeke uyithole kuma products amaningi, because it says this is the end date when nobody can sell and you are advised not to consume the product. So in most cases, most products that go for long, like your canned products, your dry products, they will have a best before date. And we need to use our intuition and say, smell it. If it is not slimy, if it doesn't look off, you can continue to utilize it. I had an oats box that was sitting with me. I won a competition. It was with me for almost 3 years. And I've seen another lawyer who's in the food sector that has got cans, a jam that is in a can container. It is not leaking, it is not bursting. He opened it, it is still okay. So I think it is education that we need to spread widely in terms of what this means. And hopefully, internationally, we will have the law that aligns, because we are guided by the law internationally and locally in terms of making it simpler for the consumers going forward.
So who gives the guarantee ke ye-quality yalokudla? Asengibekise njengelibisi nje nangabe ngithatha libisi ngilisebenzisa over the next 2 weeks, but utfola ukuthi lelibisi lisasekhashane ne-sell by date noma ke i-best before date noma ke expiry date, but now ulitaste lelibisi uva ngathi alisasilo. So nangilithatha lelibisi ngilimikisa e-supermarket but akutshela ukuthi no, alikafiki i-expiry date lelibisi leli lisase right. So who gives me the guarantee ukuthi le quality yaloko kudla isesengiyo?
Equality ifanele iyenziwe umuntu lo ayimanufacturayo, because siyenza ama-tests akuthiwa i-shelf life test. Before we put any product onto the shelves, we do all the necessary tests. We study the product. How long can it stay outside on the shelf? How long can it stay refrigerated? So that when we write instructions of storage to give to the consumer on a label, we are assured that we have done the necessary steps. So ngamanye amaxesha uthola ukuthi i-consumer ivula ubisi bese ilibeka la lizoba khona bese kuba ngathi kuthiwa i-sour milk. So i-storage nakhona is another critical aspect for consumers.
Okay, so nangabeke lelibisi utfola ukuthi bengisolo ngilibeke efrijini kepha ke alisasi kahle noma ke selibolile, ngilende njani? Ngilibisele ku manufacturer noma ngilibisele esitolo lapho ngilithenge khona?
It is always advisable to do that, because you're not only helping yourself in terms of your health and your safety, you are helping the value chain, the retailer and the manufacturer. We need to go back and say what went wrong and do corrective action so that we can improve in our processes. So people that complain, we don't normally take them as nuisance into the sector. We are saying you are helping us to do continuous improvement. Sometimes we are told ukuthi vele kunenkinga, and that's why in most cases you'll see that there's a recall that will be instituted when there's a problem that has been picked up, either from a consumer side or the manufacturer themselves, they will pick it up, or a retailer or any role player in the value chain.
And which food products are normally dumped? Nguphi ukudla lokulahlwa kakhulu? Is it the canned products? Is it vegetables? Is it starches or maybe meat? Kepha ke lengakutshela kona zange sengike ngibona inyama ilahliwe Matlou.
Inyama ayilahliwa nakushisa nyama. I'm sure ungathola ukuthi amabhini wakhona inyama iphelile. Ake ngithi Prof bayenze i-study esihle and angasitshela kakhulu ukuthi ama-products maphi manginike kuye asinike ukuthi amaphi lama-products bese sichubeke ngenkulumo.
All right, Professor, what are your thoughts? Which are some of the products that are dumped the most? Is it the canned products? Is it vegetables? Is it starches or even meat products?
Well, our research has shown that the nearly 50% of the food waste is the cereals, and that includes your baked products. So that would be typically your bread, your pop, and rice. A lot of that gets dumped, and that is typically at consumer level that it's also quite high, but also keeping in mind that those are the staples, so it's probably the produce that's the most consumed in South Africa, then it makes sense that there's quite a bit of wastage. And then followed by, onto that, is the fruit and vegetables, and that is your fresh products that generally is more perishable, have a shorter shelf life, and are exposed more to climatic conditions. So that is then the second in line. But yes, we see also even meat, fish and seafood do get wasted, but a lot less than the perishable products.
All right, Professor, let's leave it there for now. We'll be back after this break. Begunene, asasasel keflet flek gcina sitabuya khona nyalo. Welcome back, everybody. Sanamukela bakunene kule siqephu sethu sekugcina selihlelo Yilungelo Lakho ke. Let's take our first caller of the day. Sinasizakele ulapha eJozi. Sakumele lihlelweni sawubona.
Kunjani?
Siyaphila kunjani mama?
Ngiyaphila.
Khuluma nathi mama. What's on your mind?
Oh, ngithenge impuphu i-price. Yeah, i-ballot best before January 2022. But sivule izolo. Namhlanje masithi siyapheka umdoko sithola seyinobulwebu. Asazi ukuthi ikhoswa yini.
Okay. All right. Sizakele siyabonga kakhulu ke kushayela. I think that question director ke kuwe ke Matlou, I think it's just an extension of what we're discussing in terms of the quality of the product. Nangesizakele ukuthi uthi uthenge impuphu i-expire ngaJanuary umnyaka lotayo. Kepha ke bathi nabayisebenzisa namhla bathola ukuthi inebulembu. So angenta njani sizakele ngale impuphu leyo?
Into efanele ayenze uxoxisana nomthengisi wayo impupho, as we always say, that is the first point of call. Amtshele ukuthi uyithole inje, submit i-proof if usane nayo yokuthi uyithenge nini, ukuthi umthengisi naye ayazise u-manufacture. And into enye angisho ngishilo ngathi i-storage inkinga la ukuthi uthole ukuthi a very stable product, if not handled well in the value chain, that could lead to moisture absorption bese uthola ukuthi kuba nama weevils that grow in maize meal. That normally happens if there's a little bit of tampering with the storage during the storage or moisture that comes into the product. So they just need to do proper follow through from the retailer, and they can get their better product if they wish to, in accordance with the consumer laws.
Okay, asasizike Matlou, sizakele nakayithenga lempuphu uyithenge ikahle, kepha ke emva kwemalanga maybe 2-3 weeks later uthola ukuthi lempuphu secala ke kuba nebulembu noma ke secala kuba netinkinga letitsite kanti i-expiry date ingomnyaka lotako. So nakathi uyibusela esitolo ke bamtshele ukuthi kufuneka i-receipt, ngibani ongagcina i-receipt i-product sengiyisebenzisile. So what can help in this particular instance? Ingabe le barcode kuleyo product ingasebenza yini noma angenta njani?
Uma umthengisi ana sophisticated supply chain IT things that he can use to trace as to when that particular product was sold, they will be able to trace it. But I think normally the retailer must ensure that they help the person that is complaining, that showcases that they have bought you can imagine if we tenge estolo as it close by. These are the people that work with you on the daily. So that is what, in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, they need to ensure that they satisfy the consumer and ensure that they give them the necessary attention and what is the English word? Assistance and support to get their money's worth on the product that they got.
All right. Now, Professor, just in closing, do you want to share tips on what consumers should do if they are confronted with a situation of, the expiry of foods?
Okay, I think first and foremost, it comes down to how you manage the food in your own cupboards at home, in your fridge, in cupboards. If you buy new stuff, put it at the back so that the older stuff moves forward, and then you use from the front, because that will help you to use the food before it expires. Also, when you take it out of the cupboard to use and you see it is very close to the expiry date, as Matlou also indicated earlier, have a look. When you open it up, smell whether it smells okay. Inspect it visually, see if you see anything that doesn't look 100%, and then taste a small bit, and if it tastes fine, then I suppose it's fine to consume, especially if it's only a day or two after the expiry date. When it comes to a week or two after the expiry date, then I would say be careful. But I think also then, very important, when you go to the shops, make a shopping list based on what you already have in your cupboards, and then stick to your shopping list when you buy, because that will also help you control the stock at home, and also planning your meals in advance, because a lot of wastage happen as a result of impulse buying and not planning your food in advance. And if there are leftovers after a meal, try to eat it as soon as possible after that meal, by repurposing it into another meal, because that way you won't forget about it and it won't go off before you can consume it.
All right, Professor Oelofse, lovely chatting to you. Now, Matlou Setati, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Just a word of advice before we go. Ukuthi ke namba ungena esitolo ke ufuna ke food products, thatha ke lolu kungemuva ngoba phela titolo tenta njalo. Lolu kukhashana expiry bayitela ngale ngemuva. Thatha lokho ke. Hayi ke mbukele sifike kanjalo kumaphethelo enhlelo namhla. Let me thank our guests for their time. Thatha ubonga kanye nani babukele ngekuba nathi kuze kube manje. Please join us again next Tuesday when we'll be looking at why former miners who were silicosis victims are still not yet paid their monies years after winning their court battle. From me, Simpio Ngwan, and the rest of the team, stay safe and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Yilungelo.